The Mandalorian Army Box just came out and Asmodee kindly sent me one. And the timing is absolutely perfect, because after building my Separatist Clanker army and getting a few games in, I really felt an itch. Not only to refine and expand this existing army, but also to collect another one. Or 6. Obviously, I like the game, but there's something more to it. All of this feels a little bit like I felt when painting up these promotional tie-in busts Kellogg's had when episode 1 came out, in one layer of Revel enamel paint. But hey, one of my favorite sci-fi universes, if not the universe that imprinted sci-fi as my favorite genre on my malleable child brain back in the day, and I can build my own versions and paint them up. Yeah, that's a core memory unlocked. What's my age again? I have ideas for at least 3 more thematic armies, but Mandalorians offer just the right amount of customization and that ragtag group of misfits feeling that keeps me entertained. Mostly because I don't have to paint the same army scheme on every single mini. The box contains everything you need for an army of about 600 points. 36 miniatures in their new and improved plastic, and all the command and item cards you need to play them. You get a bunch of dice, but you don't get any tokens, which isn't a big deal if you own any of the starter boxes, but just be aware of it. We also get a special edition of Din Djarin and Grogu, the latter unfortunately not seeing any competitive play at the moment. And thank God, because half of my Grogu got eaten by the carpet as I assembled him. This is the way to lose tiny plastic pieces forever. Warriors are the backbone of this army. A unit consists of 5 models, one of them being the leader, and then you can add an additional mini carrying a heavy weapon if you want to. And then you have a ton of other gear options, which makes them really versatile. I'm going to start with 2 units for my first few games. I already mentioned this in another video, but I just love how these sprues stack on top of each other. So none of these delicate miniatures get bent or broken moving around in the box. And this is a funky effect. Again, let's appreciate how simple the sprue arrangement is, each mini labeled with a letter, and then you just follow the numbered bits. It's so straightforward, it makes you wonder how everyone isn't doing it this way. I really appreciate products that are just well thought out, the kind where someone clearly spent time making something more straightforward and less convoluted, like today's sponsor, Exter. I was never a fan of traditional wallets. That's why I'm so glad I found Exter and their great wallet solutions. I have been using mine for a few months now, and the leather generally feels great to touch and high quality. It's compact and yet offers room for 12 individual cards and space for cash. To get to your cards, all you have to do is press this mechanism down here and the cards pop right out. Lately, I've been using their Card Holder Pro. I can use just the card holder, but even with upgrades like the money clip backplate and the coin tray, it's still a good bit smaller than the leather wallet. I just enjoy having a really small wallet that can still hold everything I need. All the wallets have built-in RFI protection that will protect your data from getting stolen, and if you ever lose it or misplace it, you can just ping the wallet finder card with your Android or iPhone. Another thing I picked up from Exter is this vacuum travel kit that compresses clothing by 60%, so you have more space in your suitcase for minis or that sweet convention loot. This kit comes with a handy vacuum pump that sucks the air out from the bag in minutes. The bag itself is made from nylon and designed for hygiene and longevity. Right now they're running their 10th anniversary sale, which means you can save up to 40% site-wide, and using my code you can get an additional 20% off, bumping the total discount up to 60%. So follow the link in the description and use my code to grab this massive discount. Thanks a lot to Exter for sponsoring this video, and now back to assembling these Mandalorians. Assembly effort-wise, these are a little more complicated than you might expect, usually consisting of about 10 pieces, and it took me a while to assemble 12 minis. But I'm always stunned by these models. Their poses are so good, and I love the balance between credible anatomy and still making everything work in the scale. Like where others have to stylize a lot, these look like scale models to me, and I enjoy that a lot. For my leader units, I also assembled the Armorer, who is a bit slow in game but hits very hard if she makes it to her target. And it helps a little that she's the only Mandalorian unit with a health of 6. And then of course Din Djarin. I gotta say, while this is a fancy version, very dramatic, and wielding the Darksaber, I kinda prefer the slow walk version with the rifle on his back. Probably because with an open pose I can paint him in a fancier, non-metallic metal easier. but for now I want to focus on the basic troops anyway. It's good practice to mark your unit leaders, and I wanted to make mine stand out by giving them activated jump packs, and I really wanted them to make a statement. So I bought all the backpack smoke packs from Deadly Print Studios, Ren, Boba Fett, and also the ones they make for the clone troopers, so I could pick the most suitable ones. Now I was a bit lost about whether these would fit as is, because on the different units all of these backpack nozzles seem to be an uneven distance apart, Boba Fett's being the widest and the clone troopers the narrowest. Unfortunately, I had neither of these models at hand, so I made an educated guess of roughly in the middle and made them all a little smaller or a little bigger accordingly. The Boba Fett version I made smaller, ironically fit perfectly. The clone trooper variant came out a little too narrow. But the good thing is, these bits come out of the resin printer rather soft, and until you blast them with UV lights you can bend them rather easily. So I pried the two streams apart with a suitable placeholder and glued them to the backpack before putting this into my UV curing station. Problem solved. I don't know whether this was a case of me being a genius solving the problem that way, or if I just lucked out and set myself up for failure by not being able to figure out how to measure distances in the slicer. Now with all the assembly done, it was time to create some bases. And since this guy was not really designed as flying, but rather running or jumping, just look at the position of his left foot, I needed to make sure the angle was right. If I just used the smoke as is, he would have been staring up at the sky. So I grabbed this basing bit by Epic Basing and got rid of a few protruding elements to make the top flat, and then glued it on the base with a buffer of milliput so I could adjust the angles while gluing. And the result looked a lot more natural. It even ended up feeling like a bit of a ledge he was jumping on. Of course, I had to add a few details like this branch and a few filler stones I formed out of milliput to make the scene feel more realistic. Generally, the idea for my bases was mostly a desert wasteland broken up by stones that are leftovers from an ancient building, maybe a temple, for example. Epic Basing has a nice rune temple set that I used for this, and I just glued one of the elements to the base, like one of the bigger architecture elements, placing the miniatures so it looked like they are running around them or jumping over them whenever possible. I think it's fun to put a little thought into even just the tiniest base details instead of placing them completely random. This is a subtle thing but still has a bit of an impact. You know, angling the pillar a bit instead of putting it on straight, using a pile that has a small gap so the trooper can jump over, and so on. I usually look at the pose and imagine what interaction with its surrounding it allows, and then I try to find appropriate elements. To create the sand, I covered everything that was still bare base with miniput, sloping it towards the parts that were already on the base and making it look like there was more material piling up there. And then I pressed a sponge into the still soft epoxy clay. This created a finely grained texture without a lot of space or gaps between them, making it look more like closely packed, finely grained sand that is more suitable for brush painting too. To break the monotony, I added a few smaller stones here and there into the still workable clay, and that was my bases finished. Mandalorians are just such an iconic part of Star Wars for me, with the iconic armors and helmets, and here we have 10 of them. Looking forward to argue about ancient traditions and firing flamethrowers, and to get painted, of course. And after everything was cured, I gave the minis a black base coat with spray primer. While I'm usually not focused on speed with any of my painting, I'm trying to be somewhat fast with the armies I'm painting up for gaming. So the goal is to use efficient, high-impact techniques that are easy and relatively fast to do. So first of all, I'm doing some pre-shading with white. You can do this perfectly well with a rattle can. I just grabbed my airbrush and white ink so I'd have a little more control over where my midtones and highlights go. And you can see that I was giving the figure a general cenital highlight, and then I added a more focus on the helmet and the chest. So why not do this with the rattle can and move on? Well, in this stage I want to lay some groundwork for later steps. You can see that I'm deliberately putting in highlights and bounce lines, which is something I can't really do with a spray can. Could I skip all of this? Sure, but then I just spend twice as long fixing that later. Ask me how I know. Another example would be the highlight pattern on this guy's shoulder. I can also leave initial shadows on higher up areas, like the dome of the helmet, that would just get covered completely with the bigger nozzle of the spray can. Now it should become evident why I was being rather meticulous with all my pre-shading, because I wanted to establish all my base colors with contrast or speed paint. All my shadows are already blocked in, and I'm deliberately picking paints that will look intense after this first layer, like my trusty Blood Angels Red contrast paint, and if I'm lucky there'll also be some initial edge highlights showing, like on the black parts here. I don't think I'll add any more highlights on top of this. It's actually a perfect gradient, and because of the pre-shading, the highlights are in the proper place too. One of my favorite painting principles is what I call the 2-for-1 techniques. Everything I do, every brush stroke should solve at least 2 problems at once. We'll see this repeatedly throughout this video, and I'll point it out for you every time. Here the pre-shading establishes light and shadow and speeds up work time in combination with the contrast paint, because I can just switch between colors, which I will do a lot without having to paint a separate highlight for each of them. And on top of that, we also get a great intensity from the colors over white. At this point, I'm honestly a bit undecided which way to take the overall color scheme of the army. In-game, it's definitely beneficial to play all the units clan affiliated to unlock all of these juicy synergies, but I plan to tweak my army lists a little to make them more competitive as I play games and find out what works and what doesn't. At this point, I do what every Mandalorian faction does eventually, refusing to commit. And I doubt I ever will, because I find it a lot more in tune with their background of being a scattered people after their homeworld got turned into ash and still coming together regardless when it's necessary. So from here on, it was all about finding interesting color combinations, and the limiting factor actually was finding proper contrast paints that brought the intensity and one layer application that I wanted. Ultramarines blue definitely was not one of them, and it took a few layers. Not what I call high impact or time saving. I tried to implement at least one type of contrast into the schemes I was cooking up. So with the previous one, I went with a saturated red and desaturated blue-gray. Here I went for a complementary contrast with blue and orange. Unlike ultramarine blue, Fire Giant orange was fine for my purpose, but I got a harsh reminder again that some speed paints reactivate layers of paints when applied, so I was a little more careful moving forward here. On this guy, I went for a green and red complementary contrast using maggot skin, and then a little more green added to the second layer, and of course Blood Angels red. And here you can see that we additionally get a bright and dark contrast, as well as a difference in saturation between the main colors. On this one, I started from a more monochromatic scheme with a brightish yellow for the armor and a more murky yellow for the leather parts, turning this into a more triadic combination by adding this reddish purple and a turquoise for the rest of the armor elements. On this one, I went for a slightly turquoise white and a dark turquoise blue with a tiny orange detail. Basically monochrome, but playing with a bright and dark contrast too. I added another one in mostly turquoise and then just added a brown for the leather color and black. You can always add black and white. And here's another one where I was inspired by this helmet. And looking up references is actually a good way to get inspired. There's just so many Mandalorian schemes out there already. You see, I'm not picking random colors or colors that are in the right place on the color wheel. Not always anyways. The interesting paint schemes are built on contrast, not necessarily colors. When you build contrasts into the design and not just the highlights, that's when things are getting interesting. Complementary contrasts, warm, cold contrasts, saturation contrast, value contrast. The later two become very important when doing monochrome schemes, for example. Now, this took a while, but I gotta say it was a pretty cool exercise. I basically made sure that I didn't have any two miniatures that looked similar. And I do look forward to doing this all again when I add another squad of warriors to my roster. Now, once these troopers are painted, I have to think about which commanders and operatives I'll take. And that, of course, also dictates which elite units I'll have, since I can only play clan-affiliated units if there's a commander for them. Starbuck, Bo-Katan, seems to be the strongest pick since she can wield the Darksaber, which allows her Mandalorians are stronger together keyword to proliferate to other Mandalorian units, even if they're not from the same clan, which helps generate tokens and keep activations. And since activations are king in this game, well, also that means I am not confined to only Cry's units, and can mix it with Ren units with their overpowered dodge mechanics. And at the same time, my army will still have that multi-crew appearance that I'm after. And yes, I'm absolutely making competitive decisions while pretending it's all about the lore. To paint the sand on the bases, I mix the base color, taking advantage of the intensity that these instant colors provide, and adding a little opacity by adding a regular beige. And after 2 layers of the base color, I added the pure beige, diluting it with water and letting it creep into all the recesses a little, and also spread it out unevenly. And finally, I did the same with specks of ivory. Painting sand is surprisingly relaxing, maybe that's why Anakin hated it so much. I quickly painted the stones in a warm brown and added some structure mixing warm and cold grays and finally ivory. And to make them even more lively, I added a reddish brown in the darkest spots. I really wanted the rocket exhaust to make an impression, so I started from a layer of white, first with the brush, and then I switched to the airbrush to reach all of these recesses and get a more even coverage. I also made sure everything that could catch some overspray was masked off at this point, and masking can take a while, but it's still less work than repainting the whole mini because I got lazy. I was undecided at this point how far down I would let the fiery portions of the plumes go and when I'd start to make them turn black and gray. So I covered a good portion of it in yellow fluorescent paint and then switched to orange fluo, covering the raised areas so the cracks and crevices would still show the brighter paint. And next I blasted this with slaughter red. The translucent nature of it being a speed paint just helps keeping the intensity. And finally I was switching to black, and after covering the lower parts completely, I mainly focused on the upper parts of the volumes. Having the brighter parts shine through on the lower parts makes the effect look a bit more credible in my opinion. Before putting in the final gray layer, I made sure to cover anything that's directly facing the rather intense bright light source with a layer of red. It's most evident on the darker spots, but even on the brighter green areas, you can see how this is super effective to create an awesome atmosphere. And to finish the smoke plume, I finally switched to gray, and I'm generally aiming for the center of the volumes in this stage, trying to keep the recesses dark. To build the rest of the OSL, I switched to the brush because while the airbrush shines with general light directions and halo effects, that's not always how light interacts with surfaces. It catches onto edges and some features occlude others, and the airbrush mist just wants to get everywhere. So on top of the red halo that I sprayed on before, I built a light sketch with white on all the edges and surfaces directly facing the bright yellow flame. And then I covered this with orange fluo, and I think you can see how that starts tying everything together. Finally, for these parts right next to the flame, I added another very confined layer of white that I covered with yellow, and then I toned everything that looked too bright down a little with glazes of slaughter red. So just like my last army, I thought I'd try to make as much progress as possible in one day. However, I had no illusions that I could finish an army like this in a weekend, like the last time. Simply because it had all that variety and different colors. So batch painting was kind of off the table. But I wanted to at least finish my first 2 squads in 2 days. And this is the result after 1 day. And I'd say in this stage, they're perfectly fine to play a game with. One thing to note is that sometimes the contrast paint effect worked better, and sometimes it covered too much, making it feel like some areas were painted with just one opaque layer of paint. But really, this is a good base to work off of on day 2. They're already more colorful and interesting than most Imperial uniforms ever will be. Speed painting is all about solving large concepts that have the biggest impact first, and then moving on to smaller concepts. If you get the lighting right, then you can think about colors and color relationships, and then you are thinking about definition of the details, edge highlighting, texture, and weathering. Details only become interesting once the big picture already works. Or you stop after the largest concepts are done and have them carry your army. That's a possibility too. In any case, there's an intentional workflow going from large decisions to small decisions, and there's a lot of different ways to do each of these steps. You can airbrush your pre-shading, you can use a rattle can, or you can just dry brush it. You can stipple your texture with your brush tip, with a big brush. You can just edge highlight, or you can dry brush your highlights. And each of these decisions will influence how fast you are, but also how the result will look, obviously. My approach for armies is heavily built on this. I get the big picture right, which means I can play them, I have them battle ready if you want, and then I invest more time into making them look the way I want them to look. So when it comes to putting down highlights, I'm treating these minis more like scale models, making sure to define the surfaces with lots of texture, a chipped off paint, and later on some residue in the recesses. But the good thing is, most of what happens here also defines edges and surfaces, and also creates some depth and shading. And at the same time, it gives that Star Wars look that I'm after. Now this is really where the fun starts for me. I even had a little premature veteration and started to chip the turquoise paint strip here right after I applied it during day one, even though the goal was to not get carried away with detailing on the first day. Sponge chipping is fun and all, but these minis are tiny and I'd like to be a little more in control. So I just take my regular brush and I do what we're usually trying to avoid. I wait and let the paint dry a bit on the tip of the brush. That way, if I drag the brush across or dab it on, it leaves more opaque paint that goes on in a more confined way. And these thin lines and dabs look a lot more like chipping than accidentally going too wide with wet paint. I'm also dragging the brush across the edges on the red parts, for example. And here's another one of these 2-for-1 techniques. The highlight is doing double duty if you want to. It defines form, but also reads as chipped paint. Here I had a decision to make. Do I rush forward and let the edge chipping do all the work, or do I add more highlights? And I decided to invest a little more time. So I stippled on a lighter beige and made the top of the helmet brighter and also created a bit more texture that way. So again, we have another one of these 2-for-1 techniques because you can see how this not only creates texture, but it also creates highlights. I continued doing this, just using a little lighter shade of whatever the base color I was dealing with. For the red parts, because I wanted to avoid it turning too pink, I went straight to ivory for the highlight. And again, this doubles as both highlights and it looks a little like chipped off paint on the edges. On some parts where the contrast paint didn't quite work with the pre-shading, I established the highlights a little more deliberately to make these parts overall brighter, like on that indent on the helmet that's facing up and the upper leg, and then continued with the more specular stippled on highlights, often jumping right into ivory again. On most minis, the contrast paint did a great job though, and it gave me a good base to just add highlights to, and actually on most of these I used the same highlight color. On darker colors I mixed it into the base color, and on brighter colors I used it straight away. It doesn't matter if it was dark blue, dark gray, or yellow, orange, you get the idea. On the bright green guy, I went for a bright turquoise because the added blue made these highlights look a little colder and more interesting, especially next to the warm OSL coming from the jetpack. I stuck to the same principles, working mostly over these areas that got pronounced by the pre-shading and defined edges and shapes using stippling and painting scratches to highlight everything up. Then I picked up a black brown and again using very dry paint on the brush I added some dark chipping on exposed round parts like the shoulder armor and the helmet, but also the edges of the chest armor. And then I repeated this on every single dude with a bright armor. Obviously it makes sense to not do this on dark parts because it won't have as much impact. But on bright armor, this is just another layer of detail that doesn't take long and improves this type of more rugged paint job a lot. I had some elements that looked a little too monotonous, like the backpacks, and to break it up I simply added color panels to them, kind of like markings. And I also did that on the flat rifles, where I simply extended the shape of these foregrip-like structures in a color I already had on the model. And then I banged these up a bit. Really, it was fun to play with one of the defining aesthetic philosophies of Star Wars. I believe back in the day someone said, every scratch feels like a story, every clean surface would feel like a lie. And basically nothing looking factory fresh, every starship, every helmet, every blaster carrying the fingerprints of its history. And so I applied a couple of gray and brown filters to a lot of these uniform surfaces, like on the blasters, giving each panel a slightly different discoloration, and then chipping the paint and putting dents in the edges of the rifle, first with the base color and then gradually going brighter. I also did the same with a couple of these recesses, like on the helmets. On the brighter colors it was especially effective. But also darker panels like the turquoise shoulders, and even the red got a lot more depth once I added a couple of thin glazes in the shadows. Just another detail to make this universe look lived in and real. And even though I could go on and on and on, adding details and some chipping here and a scratch there, eventually you got to say good is good enough. And at the end of day 2, I had my first 2 squads of this new army done. And what can I say? Not only am I proud of this group, looking at them makes me really excited for the next squad, and of course the leaders and operatives. And let me know how you like them, and if you have played a game with the Mandalorian Army in Star Wars Legion yet. Did you enjoy the playstyle? Which units should I add and which should I avoid? Thanks a lot for watching this video. Keep on happy chipping and see you in the next one. And if you're interested in picking this up, I put a few links in the description. Go check them out.